This is Nabeel Naqvi of Naqvi Law Professional Corporation, and today we are talking about ILA versus ILR. So you may or may not have heard these terms before. What it means is independent legal advice versus independent legal representation. So what does that mean? Let's find out. ILA and ILR. So we're looking at this in the context of basically real estate transactions. And so independent legal advice is where you will have an outside lawyer who's providing the advice. So what do I mean by outside lawyer? So if I am in a law firm, although there may be several lawyers that I work with, those lawyers are still considered inside lawyers because they're inside that law firm. So independent legal advice is provided by an outside lawyer who's not related to that client's matter, any of the parties, or even the lawyer who's handling the transaction. In other words, they don't have a conflicting interest. Okay, so in the context that we're speaking of, this occurs where, for example, there is a couple, a husband and wife, are getting a mortgage on their matrimonial home. And although the home is only under the name of the husband, the wife has rights as a spouse and therefore must consent to this transaction. Now, in many cases, the lender or the bank who's lending the money on that mortgage will require that spouse, so the wife in our case, to get independent legal advice from a lawyer outside the law firm who's representing the husband. Now you might ask, well, they're husband and wife, they know each other, they live in the same house, why do they need independent legal advice? It's a good question, and the answer is so that we're assured that the wife has an appreciation of the nature and consequence of completing this transaction. Yes, she's not on title, but she's the spouse of the owner of the house. And therefore, if that mortgage goes into default, let's say they can't make their payments, then the wife is equally on the hook for that mortgage. What do I mean by that? The wife would generally have right to 50% of that equity in that home. Now, that equity is being reduced by this mortgage, and therefore, by getting this independent legal advice, the wife cannot come back afterwards and say, well, I didn't know that if I wasn't on title, I could still lose the equity in this matrimonial house that I live in. So that's one example of independent legal advice. And so the main thing to keep in mind here is that it's an outside lawyer who's providing the advice. And it's almost kind of ancillary or kind of secondary to the main transaction, for example, here the mortgage. So then a secondary component is getting that consent from the spouse. So what is independent legal representation then? So the representation part of it is when an actual other lawyer is required to be retained to represent one of the parties in the transaction. So the most common example of that is mortgages over $50,000 and transfers of property where you're transferring one property out of one person's name to another, a purchase and sale, for example, generally speaking, require more than one lawyer. So now, instead of just providing advice, this lawyer has now been retained to actually represent the interests of that party, and they will be involved in the transaction either as, for example, in a mortgage, as the borrower's lawyer, and I should say private mortgage here, as the borrower's lawyer or the lender's lawyer. So where, for example, the private mortgage that you are getting is over $50,000, it's not enough to basically have one lawyer. Again, there are exceptions, which we're not going to get into here. But you need two lawyers involved in that transaction, one to represent and advise and get instructions from the lender, and one lawyer to advise and get instructions from the borrower. And same thing with the transfers of property. We are approached all the time by spouses who may or may not be separating, and they need to transfer the property out of one name to the other. In those situations, we highly, highly recommend that each party has their own lawyer, because after the transaction is closed, we don't want anyone to come back and say, well, we're not sure if you are actually representing our best interests or were you representing the other person's best interests. So to avoid that entire dilemma, we highly recommend as lawyers to get independent legal advice or independent legal representation as is required. If you have any other questions about that, or if you have a transaction coming up where you do need representation, feel free to contact us. My email is nabeel@naqvilaw.ca or visit naqvilaw.ca.